Welcome to Austin Film Society at the Marquesa. I'm just curious, there's a lot of faces I don't recognize. How many have never been to our theater here? That's fantastic. You have to become a member before you leave. It's $50. I'll be collecting. No, we would love for you to become a member. Between Holly Herrick, Lars Nielsen, and myself, we program over 200 different films here annually. And I believe this is the first one we've done with the Texas Archive of the Moving Image. We're very excited about it. It's a perfect film for our co-presentation. The film is fascinating. Caroline is going to give a wonderful introduction to the film, how it was restored, found, and all. And then we will have a panel discussion with special guest Janna Jones afterwards. So thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you so much to Chale and to the Austin Film Society. In addition, we'd like to thank Humanities Texas for helping us bring this film, what I'd like to say, back home. We are the Texas Archive of the Moving Image. We're an organization based here in Austin, and our mission is to discover, preserve, make accessible, and educate the community about Texas's rich film heritage. We're here at the Austin Film Society. A lot of you know the incredible work that Richard Linklater and Robert Rodriguez and other independent filmmakers based here in Austin have done. What you might not know is that the legacy of independent film production in Texas dates all the way back to the beginning, the inception of film itself, back to the 1890s. And so in some funny ways, it's a perfect partner, AFS, with us today for this particular film. This film, The Daughter of Dawn, was produced by a company named the Texas Film Company. And I just want to say right now that I hope everyone stays for the Q&A that will take place, a conversation with Dr. Jones from Northern Arizona University and myself. But the one question I can't answer, let's just plant this right now, tell me more about the Texas Film Company, Tom. I have no idea, right? So that's the great mystery, and that's one of the fun things that we do at the Texas Archive of the Moving Image, is try to find the missing stories that make up Texas film history. There's very little information about the company that actually produced this film. And in essence, it's a miracle that this film even still exists in any way, shape, or form. I like to use these statistics, and those of you that have heard these a million times, I'm sorry, but they're really important. Over 90% of films made before the silent era, sound era, I should say. I was about to say the films made in the silent era, but basically before 1927, 90% of them no longer exist. And that statistic is actually only for Hollywood-produced films. If you start talking about films like the Texas Film Company, I would say the statistic is more like 99.9% of films made in this early era no longer exist. There are a variety of factors as to why that's the case, which we'll talk about after the film is complete. But I did just want to point that out, that what you're seeing tonight is incredibly special. Incredibly special. The story about how it was found, also special, because it was sort of discovered / given to a private eye. Yeah, it's like out of some sort of bizarre Humphrey Bogart movie from the 40s. A private detective was given this film in lieu of cash payment. Now, how that went down, God only knows. I like the idea that somebody's like, look, I can't pay you, but how about a nitrate film from 1920? It's going to be a bestseller. The private investigator, no fool he, brought it to the Oklahoma Art Museum and asked for something. I'm going to make this up, but I think it was like $1 million. You can have this film. And they were like, I don't think so, go away. Finally, though, they were able to work out a deal, and the Oklahoma Historical Society purchased the film from the private investigator. Fast forward, they did obtain a National Film Preservation Foundation grant. The film was restored, and subsequently, what we're going to see tonight, it was scanned with a 4K scanner. For those of you that are interested in the technical side, this film will never have looked any better. And the other part is, this film was rarely shown. Purportedly, it was shown a couple of times, maybe, but knowing the press from that period of time, it could have all been planted by the filmmakers. It was very, very likely not even shown once in the state of Texas. So we're so glad to bring it home. I don't want to tell too much about this right now because we will be having a kind of conversation after the film, so we really hope that you'll stick around for that. We'll just have a really brief setup after the film completes. I did, however, want to point out a couple things so that as you watch the film, you can keep an eye out for it. First off, I should say that the score is a recently commissioned score. Obviously, this film was silent. It was a recently commissioned score by actually a Comanche composer, commissioned by the Oklahoma Historical Society. So they were very, very pleased to have actually worked with a local composer for this. So the soundtrack you hear is from him. It was important for a number of different reasons we'll get into after you see the film. Very important that two of the leads here are Quanah Parker's children. And again, we'll talk more about Quanah Parker. We'll talk about the importance of them being in this film as basically celebrities. But the characters, and I wrote this down because I knew I would mess it up, White Parker plays White Eagle, and Wanada Parker plays Red Wing. So a little just helping you out there, which is really interesting. I'd add, too, that the props here are all quote-unquote authentic. We'll get into what that means later. All authentic, meaning that the Native Americans, this is an entire Native American cast, all brought their own props, quote-unquote, right? So all of this material, some of which is actually now in the Oklahoma Historical Society, including teepees and a number of different kinds of artifacts. And lastly, I would just point out that the location of this particular film has incredible roots to Quanah Parker's legacy as well. This film was shot in the Wichita Mountains in Oklahoma. Some of you maybe have been there, not far from where Quanah Parker's home stood. And indeed, it was because of Quanah Parker's celebrity and his incredible, his celebrity, but also hosting of a variety of important American political figures, including Teddy Roosevelt, that this particular Wichita Mountains region became a wildlife, in fact, one of the first wildlife centers and parks. It was really rumored to be that because Quanah Parker wooed and really, really captivated Teddy Roosevelt, that Teddy Roosevelt turned around and made this a national park. So it's just kind of interesting context to how important Quanah Parker's legacy is, both to the actual filming, the stars of the film tonight, but also to the context. So I hope that you will really enjoy the film. We're so appreciative to AFS and Humanities Texas to be here, and appreciative to you for supporting us. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you once again, everyone, for coming out, and especially Humanities Texas and the Austin Film Society, because we were just saying, both of us have seen this film maybe a few occasions, and to see it up on the big screen makes everything different. I just kept thinking it's just such a great opportunity to be able to see all of the detail, which in some ways I think makes the whole kind of the value of the artifact even more pertinent in terms of film preservation, but I also like seeing the slightly terrified look of the horses. I don't know if anybody else was fascinated with their eyeballs that were just like, I don't know what's going on, but I hope this ends soon. So it was great fun, and a big thanks to you all. I thought that I would just briefly say a few words about the little bit of information that we actually kind of know about the film before asking Janna to talk a little bit more about the kind of wider cultural context, a little bit more about how this film works against many of the films of the era that really look at Native Americans. But I thought, again, I would just start with the artifact that we have here. Essentially, one of the things I'd point out is that films made from this particular era were made on something called silver nitrate. And that's really important, and it's probably one of the more fun aspects of film preservation, which, let's face it, is not the sexiest sell, but nitrate film actually can spontaneously combust. It's made of the same material that gunpowder is made from. So in early motion picture history, one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that a lot of films from this era don't exist is because it was made of a slightly problematic substance, combined with the fact that early film exhibition actually did use an actual flame, gunpowder. Not a good combo. So that's why in a lot of old movie theaters you would see these basically nitrate doors that would basically trap the projectionist but leave everybody else okay. So there's lots of interesting aspects as to why a lot of the films from this era didn't exist. But in actual fact, in addition to the kind of physical properties associated with why these films don't exist, there's just the sheer fact of a lot of independent productions not being collected, not being preserved in the same problem we probably even have today. And this film is a prime example of that. Very little is known really about the two people that produced and wrote this film. One of the characters, Norbert Miles, who was responsible for producing the film, does have a little bit of a background. Say you look him up on IMDb later, if so inclined, you're going to see quite a bit of information. All generated, however, by Norbert Miles himself. All of the information is based on some scant documents, autobiographical, that are actually at the Margaret Herrick Library at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Los Angeles. It's a great, great collection, and the only information actually pertaining to this film really comes from that document that was basically about him talking about his time with the Indians. In one of so the little information we have is biased from the standpoint that it was written by somebody who obviously had an investment in telling a great story about his career. But he did, in fact, have Hollywood credentials, and an important thing to keep in mind is that when this film came out, Hollywood was very nascent. Hollywood is not the Hollywood then was not the Hollywood that we think of today. It was still evolving. It was still a very, very early time period in essentially before LA was LA, right? And so what you have at this period of time is a lot more of a fluid kind of filmmaking culture, and this film is actually a part of that. So you had Norbert Miles in addition to the other filmmaker here, and the two of them actually purportedly met in Hollywood. They purportedly met on the set of some film and basically decided, why are we shooting westerns, here? Why are we shooting narratives here when we could actually go to where many of these stories actually took place? Why don't we go back? And the story itself was essentially, and again, purportedly through Norbert Miles's recollection, based on a apocryphal or a traditional story from the Comanche themselves that had been told and retold and retold. So that's kind of the scant information we have as to the background of this film, but in and of itself it does provide an interesting comparison or point of comparison and contrast to other films of the era. So I'll turn it over to Janna to talk a little bit about that.
Well, Caroline and I were talking earlier today. I am in a very interesting situation where I'm able to teach in Flagstaff, and if you've ever been to Flagstaff, you know it's like so fabulous. But also, it's the Navajo and Hopi reservations are right there adjacent to NAU. So NAU has one of the largest Native American population of students in the country, so I'm very fortunate to teach film and Native Americans and talk to my kids about growing up being a Native American and always watching somebody else tell your story. So imagine being a white person. It looks like you can do that pretty easily today. And imagine that every film you've ever watched about yourself was written by an African American or a Native American. And so they have a very different relationship to storytelling than my white students. And so we talk about this. And it's like, well, did you want to be the Indian or the cowboy? It's like, oh, we always wanted to be the cowboy. Why would anyone want to be the Indian? So this is kind of my entree into you know, kind of Native American history in Hollywood and the impact that it had. And just, I think it had a terrible impact for Native Americans, because that most white people lived in urban areas and Native Americans lived more isolated. And so rarely did they meet in a real way. So the way that white people understood Native Americans was through stories told by white people about Native Americans. Now, Native Americans during this period were critiquing what was going on. There were often movie theaters around or by reservations, and Native Americans would often write letters to the editor, for example, and say these movies are ridiculous and we are laughing at the way that we're being represented. But also Native Americans were were actors, and they often resisted the way they were being portrayed, even as they were being filmed. For example, some films would have them speaking in Navajo or whatever. Well, nobody on the set or whatever is gonna ever go, what exactly are they saying? But actually what they were saying was, this movie is the bottom half of a snake. You know, I mean, they were very, right there on the film, it's all, you know, it's all there. So they were critiquing and they were resisting. So, so the beauty, I was so pleased to be able to come and talk about this film and think about this film, because I'm thinking of my students, you know, where finally here's a film where there's no white people in this film. Now it's told by a white person, and that kind of like, here, this is the story based on whatever his name is, you know, who lived with the natives for 25 years. So it's a very anthropological kind of notion, and it's like, oh, it wouldn't occur to us to like just maybe ask them the story. It has to be somehow translated by some sort of scientist person. So there are some, you know, kind of ways that it succumbs to those traditional ideas. But then we have this beautiful story that is all native cast. There's not a white person in this thing. There's no problems with white people. There's no white people taking the maiden. There's no, you know, white people killing, or it's as if there are no white people. So, so that is that's very unusual. There are, you know, maybe one or two other films out there that exist that we know of that work in this way. So I'm going to take a breather because I know I've been chatting for a while there. So
No, I think that's a really good way of thinking about how do we place this very, very rare artifact into context, because so many of the films, and the other portion of this, of course, is that it's not a Western, right? It's really interesting because this is a romance, and maybe it perhaps does not hold up as well because of that. But it's not a Western, again, told from a very specific kind of perspective. In terms of thinking about Native American indigenous culture as represented on the screen, I think it's important to note that for those of you that maybe when you think of this, you think of the Western, you think of John Ford, you think of John Wayne, that in actual fact the first quote-unquote Western was actually produced in Denmark in the late 1890s. And I find that a really fascinating issue. And it quickly followed, of course, by other filmmaking communities. Okay, so some in the United States, particularly out of New Jersey, of course, a state known for its Western heritage. But you do have, as one of my favorite things when people talk about the Great Train Robbery as being the first Western. It's not. Okay, let's just all agree it's a crime story. The point being that you have a lot of disparate communities around the world creating these Westerns. Well, why is it these Westerns are taking place in the United States? What are they saying about the United States through this idea of the Western? When I think about that and trying to bring it back to Daughter of Dawn, what I think about are the captivity narratives.
Because in essence, why is it that a lot of us in here would come see this film? It's because of its relationship to Cynthia Ann Parker, kind of the poster child, if you will, for the captivity, the ultimate captivity narrative. And so when I mean captivity narrative, of course, is what was very, very popular in Europe, were stories about captive, those Europeans, particularly women and children, that were held captive by Aboriginal tribes in the United States in particular. So going back to the 17th century into the 18th century, some of the most popular books were captivity narrative stories. And in essence, we see that passed down and passed down and passed down until where here in Texas, we have that story of Cynthia Ann Parker being kidnapped, becoming a part of her community, and then kidnapped or rescued back again. But by that time, of course, she's had her son, Quanah, who then goes on to play such an important role in not only Texas history, but of course, U.S. history as well. So I think that tying these kinds of narratives together is a really important component. And when you look at the very, very beginnings of film history, of which this is an important part, you're seeing also that stories are being told all over the United States, and not just in LA, not just in New York and New Jersey. What we've lost so much of are these kind of alternative stories, alternative ways of not only looking at communities, but actually depicting them. It's great fun. We were able to screen not long ago one of the early westerns out of the San Antonio Star Film Ranch. We were able to do that. Some of you maybe know that the very famous filmmaker Georges Méliès actually started a couple of branches in the United States to combat piracy. There's some irony there. But he actually founded a branch of his company in San Antonio. Very, very, very few of those films exist, but we actually took one back to San Antonio. And it's great fun to be able to watch it because we can recognize Central Texas. We're not always sort of saying, that doesn't look like the West, that looks like New Jersey. We're actually saying, oh yeah, okay, this is how we can place the narrative. So I think that there are many different levels of what this particular film represents to us today.
Well, one of the things that I find just fabulous about it, along these lines of that there is that captivity narrative, and actually what happens, and I swear to God this doesn't happen again until Australian Aboriginal films in the early 2000s, maybe the 1990s, is that you see a native relationship on screen. That it's not, that we see a beautiful native woman and a beautiful native man love each other and very sweetly look at one another. Isn't that weird that just doesn't happen? For 80 years, it never happens. And the most important thing for me in this film is that she got exactly the guy that she wanted, you know? This film ends with them happily ever after. Not with some, white guy or whatever, trying to figure out a new identity and all that stuff. No, she just gets to be with the good-looking guy that she wanted all along. So, to me, it's a real victory,
No offense to Kevin Costner, Colin Farrell.
He's a fine
they're
guy.
lovely. They're lovely. But we don't have to go through an existential crisis of who am I? I should wear a wolf hat.
Exactly. I just get to be with the hot guy who survived the jump on the cliff.
I hope you all enjoyed the early special effects. When this film was rediscovered and many people were talking about how to raise money, because it took quite a while to raise the money for the restoration. Everybody was so obsessed with special effects. I just remember there was a group of film archivist nerds huddling around a computer being like, good God, look at that. When I saw it up on the screen, I was like, well, it's really not that impressive. But we thought it was really neat when we first started.
Well, another thing that I just wanted to mention too that's very unusual is how articulate that they present their language. It's not this pidgin English stuff. It's beautiful. I mean, I'm sure that's not how they spoke. I'm sure nobody in the 1920s was really speaking that way, but nonetheless, it's, they in no way ever presented these people as somehow inarticulate in any way. You know, they have a full emotional range. One of the things that you may not know about the kind of stoic Indian idea is that that's really an anthropologically driven one, because anthropology saw itself as a science. And when it began studying Native Americans, they would take photographs of them, and they had to be scientific looking, so they would not smile, so don't smile for the camera. And literally that becomes the idea, that's where the Stoic Indian idea comes from, is this anthropological idea. So like Native actors would, you know, like try out for parts, and it would be like, okay, but be like more Stoic Indian. You know, so that was just something, a performative thing that they were themselves being asked to do. So, so we see the kind of full range of emotions here, and we also see them being extremely articulate about the way that they feel, and you know, I mean, and daughter of Don, she was tough, man. She was pushing those guys away and telling her dad, no, this is the guy that I want. You know, she had, I mean, her dad, and like dads can be, you know, they're always sort of the last word, but she got to, you know, really make some decisions here and voice what she wanted. So, yay, daughter of Dawn.
Well, I'd say to the point of language and our articulation and this, it's interesting too, if you look at the only material that still exists in terms of any kind of production material related to it, you see that, I'm going to get the name right, it's Norbert, right? Yeah. It just doesn't sound right. Norbert Miles has this kind of patronizing, well, not kind of patronizing, has a patronizing comment in his description of filming by saying that, and it was something like a direct quote, where he writes that he's telling his colleagues in Hollywood, right, that he's going into the heart of it. He's going to Texas, he's going to Oklahoma, and he is going to be shooting with the natives there. And of course, the response is, good God, be careful, Norbert, you might be scalped, right? This is his direct quote. And then he writes back, what my friends in Los Angeles didn't realize was that when I got there, not only was I not scalped, but they spoke much better English than my friends in LA. So there's this idea, right, of language, of what is appropriate behavior, what is assumed to be, the role of kind of the Aboriginal culture from this period of time is really significant. And I think time in and of itself is important to note, because when we think about the resurrection of the story of Cynthia Ann Parker, when we think about the celebrity culture that continues to surround the Parker family, in particular Quanah, the first book, I believe, and probably some folks here will correct me if I'm wrong, the first book really about Cynthia Ann Parker's story comes out only about 30 years before this film is actually made. And there had been a number of, there's a number of newspaper articles, lots of discussion about it, but in actual fact, that first book, which then turns into many others, is not that far removed from when this film is actually conceived of and actually produced. In addition, the context to this, of course, is that Quanah is very much a celebrity. One of the things that fascinates me about Quanah Parker as kind of Texas legend on a variety of levels is one component that doesn't get discussed very much in many of the straight history books, is this idea of Quanah Parker as celebrity and of media star. And that's maybe from the standpoint of the Texas Archive of the Moving Image. We're really interested in looking at, okay, what does this mean in terms of media? And Quanah Parker actually himself sort of starred in a film in 1908, only 3 years before he passed away. And what's interesting about that particular film, again, I'm going to get this wrong because one of the most famous early films that exists is The Great Train Robbery, right? It's all in the kind of canonical textbooks, all this. The film Quanah Parker was in was called The Bank Robbery, and was actually shot, much like this, was actually shot in Quanah's hometown in Oklahoma. And it's actually a reenactment of an actual bank robbery, in which he kind of comes in and leaves, comes in, I think, in a coach or something like this. One of the fascinating aspects of
Native American participation, or indeed Mexican American participation in films from the early silent era, is that a lot of it was based on reenactments. So that a great example of this is a film that is not yet, but soon will be in our collection online, is a film called Ammunition Smuggling on the Mexico Border. Okay? And you think of that and you think, oh, sounds like a really, really dubious, you know, or it sounds like television, right, tonight. But you know, this story, and what that actually is a story from the Mexican Revolution reenacted by not only the people who, the sheriff who basically succeeded, but also the entire community of El Paso. Basically, like, sure, we'll do that again. Why not? And that's what you see very much of, is this idea of film as being truth. This idea of early film representing the real, representing what actually occurred, which I think is a whole nother component of early film and its relationship to Native cultures. In the same way that Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley and a lot of these people who were sort of incredible celebrities from dime novels and newspapers, when film comes around in the 1890s, you now get to see them. So if you would go to vaudeville and be able to see some of those early motion pictures, you'd actually not only get to see your favorite boxing star, your favorite kind of New York opera star, you'd actually get to see someone like Quanah Parker that you had read about over and over, and now you actually got to see. So there's this interesting dynamic between a story and a narrative, and then the real, the truth, purportedly the truth, what we think it should have been.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about too, Caroline, is the how lucky we are that this film exists for so many reasons, but to see the beautiful interior of the teepees, and even though it was set for the movie, it is in fact, you know, the real things, and how it would be decorated and arranged, and it just looked like a great place to take a nap. I really liked it a lot. And as we were talking earlier too, is also that horse culture, and that we're really able to see, obviously the horses, you said, seemed a little anxious about being filmed, but they didn't really know. That was
just me. Just
I'm just kidding. But for me, I am a horseback rider, and so to the way that they, the bridle thing, the rope, and the way that those are very fit horses. Those are clearly horses that are from a small stock, because in many ways they look like almost the identical horses. And just how well trained they were, and that there were no like tripwires and all of those things used. Those were just like really fabulous, awesome horses, and the chief's horse in particular, I'll say, was a thumbs up. And the clothing and all of those things, those are for real. It's a story, but it's all for real. And so that gives us the opportunity to take a glimpse into, you know, into the reality of their daily lives. And I just always really like that.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this, I think this is why this is rich. This particular film has received so much attention, and is one of the very, very, very few, I can't even think of when the last time this happened, one of the very few truly independent films from, let's say, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, has actually been picked up for distribution. The fact that we can come here and see a 4K scan of this in a kind of state-of-the-art theater is extraordinary. Usually, you know, you're kind of hauling out some really decrepit 16mm projector and begging people to come in. This was picked up for distribution, and it has been showing actually around the world. And it is testimony to this intersection of both narrative, kind of mythological lore, and truth. As I mentioned before, the kind of most elaborate teepee that you saw in the film is actually now in the Oklahoma Historical Society. And when the Oklahoma Historical Society first saw this film, they got really excited because they knew the provenance of that actual teepee, but they had no idea that it had been used in the actual film. So there was this really kind of nice moment for them where they saw how this has actually been a part of material culture in a different entire way. Well, I thought maybe I would open up for any kinds of questions, hopefully that we can address or answer, particularly if you have anything about the restoration itself. We'd be glad to talk about that. Yeah, right here.
How much of this was lost?
Okay, the question was how much of this particular film was lost? Very little, which is another remarkable component. Very little of this was lost. As you can see, it actually plays pretty well. You're not missing a few chunks of the film halfway through the narrative. I mean, granted, it's a simple narrative. It's a simple story. It plays pretty well. In a lot of films from this particular era, if a great deal had been lost, what a film restoration lab will do, or the archivist will do, is actually create a new intertitle to explicate what's been lost. As you can see, that wasn't necessary here. You can see, however, the nitrate decomposition on the side right. I hope everybody got a chance to see. If you wondered what's that look, it wasn't art. That's decomposition. My theory on this is that the print was actually relatively well taken care of. Maybe it was inside, but it also helps that Oklahoma's relatively dry. What we found with our Texas Archive and Moving Image program, in which we've crisscrossed the state of Texas with the Bring Out Your Film campaign, the films that suffer the most in Texas should be no doubt are those near the Gulf Coast, because humidity is the devil. Humidity is what really kills film. So in this particular case, I think they really benefited from the fact that it was likely housed fairly well. In terms of what you can see was lost the most were the intertitles, right? Did you see how there was a different look to the intertitles? Some were fairly elaborate and somewhat melodramatic. That's always my favorite part of the silent films, are the intertitles. I always wait for them. I get really excited. You can see that they actually had to replace a number of the intertitles with a very contemporary font, and it was a digital. Those are actually digitally restored. There are, and I was thinking about, I wish in a way it had been restored by some of my colleagues at George Eastman House, because they actually specialize in recreating the fonts of the silent era. Talk about a specialty. If you guys are in need of that, I'll put you in touch with the guy, right? The guy that literally recreates the fonts. But they would have had to go in to actually work on those. And the reason often that those decompose the most has to do with the fact that they're spliced in. Right? So those of you that know your filmmaking techniques, you usually can see that there's going to be some pretty bad decomposition when there's a splice. And that's mainly because you have a lot of different chemicals at play. So over time, those chemicals are not, they don't get along very well, and so they then eat away at the film. But it's an interesting film from the standpoint that it was in relatively good shape. It definitely needed a lot of help. It had shrunk quite badly, which is also a very, very difficult thing to do when you're doing photochemical restoration. You literally have to take it frame by frame. You're almost rephotographing the entire film frame by frame. So it was incredibly, incredible and a very meticulous process. I also thought I would say, again, for people who are here and really love old films and are interested in preservation, I noticed as the credits went up that the film, and I'd forgotten, but this film was restored at a lab in downtown Hollywood called Film Technology. And I'd worked with film technology for years and years and years. An amazing place, had been around since probably about the 1950s, where a lot of big Hollywood studios had their films restored. It shut down 3 months ago. And the reason being, the death of film. We're seeing the end of, well, we've already seen it, but you see the end of 35mm and what that actually means for films that need this kind of meticulous restoration in order to be seen again. We have a very, very short window. Very short window. At this point, there's basically 2 labs, almost even down to 1, that could do this kind of hands-on work, which is really a shame.
How much was the grant for restoring this film?
I actually don't know for sure. The core of the grant probably was in the ballpark of about $20,000, but I know additional money was raised, and I know additional money was raised for the scoring and for the distribution. But the minimum amount that the National Film Preservation Foundation would have put in is $20,000 for, let's say, an average Hollywood motion picture for just its photochemical preservation. Say it's something like
The Big Sleep. Big Sleep was a complicated project. I don't know what I'm talking about that one. But your kind of average motion picture, let's say from the 40s, just a basic photochemical preservation would cost you about $30,000 to $40,000 without any kind of striking or different kinds of prints. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned that this is one of the few films that all Native American Indian cast was in. Do you happen to know the titles of the other two films, or so?
You know, I say like it's one of the few because I, like Caroline, know a lot about, you know, that films disappear. Honestly, during this period, this is really kind of it as a fictional film with an all Native cast. I know like more documentary type of films and those kind of things, but really, I mean, there's, you know, and in terms of like a whole film that exists, this is about as good as it gets. So
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. The question was, you know, are there other what are the other films that have only, you know, Comanche, Kiowa cast? You know, again, I would point out that when we think about that statistic of the silent era, that 90% loss, let's flip it, only 10% of films made from that period actually do exist. And of that, we're really talking, I mean, I hate to bring up the name that I never want to bring up, like, it's D.W. Griffith, who was not, by the way, very friendly to Native Americans, right? We talk a lot about D.W. Griffith and the birth of the nation, but I would argue that he was perhaps even more reprehensible in his work representing Native Americans. He liked to represent Native Americans as being basically cannibals, but those films remain because places like the Museum of Modern Art collected art. So I think what's exciting about your question is, what else are we going to find? Because I think with efforts like what hopefully we're trying to do with efforts out of Oklahoma with the incredible support of the National Film Preservation Foundation and the Library of Congress, what we're trying to do is to recreate this kind of American film history, and we don't know. Maybe there is somewhere in El Paso where somebody actually has a feature film that might change our whole perspective on what actually was produced. I think in the same way that digital technologies are changing the way we research because we have a lot more access to local newspapers, and that's where we found the story of this.
But,
so what I'm hoping is we can find more.
And I would just say that, I mean, just, then it all changes in the 60s or so, because then Native Americans are able to get a hold of cameras for themselves, really. They're become affordable enough. So it definitely changes in the second part of the 20th century. And I'll just tell you, you know, Smoke Signals is an older film now, but all of my students, and particularly my Native American students, you know, that is like, that film changed everything. And so, you know, they can totally identify finally with a film because it tells a real story. Even this story is lovely, but it's like these people exist in some timeless era, you know. I mean, that's not how Native Americans were necessarily living in the 1920s. So it's not really until the era of Smoke Signals where you're really seeing Native Americans in real time doing real, like, life things, you know. So it takes us so long, but I just want to say, you know, my students just completely come alive when they finally can see themselves like just doing normal things like being on a bus, you know, and not like being in a teepee of which none of them have ever even seen before. So.
Yes, in the back.
It's supposed to be representative. I was a little surprised that the Comanches weren't more aggressive and hostile, having read lots and lots about them, and that the Kiowas would win against the Comanches. And also, I really hope to see some good bow and arrow shooting underneath the horse's neck. So I wondered if you could address that. I mean, why they were so maybe peaceful with each other in this film.
Because it's a film about love. I just don't think we have to say anything else. I mean, you know, love stories just can kind of bypass all of that violent stuff. So that would be my answer.
Well, and I think there are a lot of factors that we could largely attribute to why that would be the case. At this point, you have these tribes on federally sanctioned land. You have very strict rules at this point in time about what can actually be represented in media, right? You know, even certain kinds of war dances were not allowed to be performed, just writ large. So the idea of filming them and then purportedly distributing it for small children to see, oh no, that's not going to happen, right? So I would imagine that this choice of a love story and a quote-unquote traditional story was very, very much a conscientious decision. I would say, kind of along the lines of what Janna was saying, though, is where you can actually see some of that footage. Is we had a reel. Unfortunately, we weren't able to show it very long before the feature. But what you do see is a lot of, again, reenactments of things like a buffalo jump or buffalo hunt, or you actually see reenactments, particularly Charles Goodnight, on Charles Goodnight's property in Palo Duro Canyon. There's a really interesting film in which a lot of this is reenacted. In travel films, which are very, very, very important from this point in time. Say you go to a theater and you're going to see a travel log that goes through the West. You often have, again, through the eyes of kind of a European American saying, look at this Comanche do X, Y, and Z. You'll see it performed, but not within a narrative of this particular era. I think would you see it being replicating these kinds of activities and actions. But it's a really good point, because I think when you read about it, you think, oh yeah, we're going to get a chance to see what went down. No, but it is interesting, isn't it? Because this is a Comanche. The Comanche Kiowa exchange here is pretty interesting, and I kept sort of thinking I'd love to be a lip reader to kind of lean in and then actually talk to some of the people who are just on the side. I love the looks of some of the people who are just like, you got to be kidding me. Like what are we doing? You know, kind of staring up in the distance. It would be interesting to interview them. Yes, over here.
What language were they speaking, and has anyone tried to recreate the script, you know, from lip reading or whatever?
The question was about what language are they speaking in recreating the script. Very good question. I actually don't have an answer to that question. I know that part of it is in English. I know that for sure that part of it is in English. And I think there were different languages being spoken. In terms of the transcript, I believe the Oklahoma Historical Society is still on a track. Their goal is, once the film is taken out of, let's say, kind of theatrical distribution, they're going to create a Blu-ray DVD that has a number of these kinds of elements in that. So I believe they're doing some research into it. It will require, however, a lip reader. There's no doubt it will require, because there is no transcript. There is no transcript now. The only information pertaining to the film outside of the film itself and that autobiographical account is actually at the Library of Congress for copyright deposit. The filmmaker did deposit photographs from the set. So for a long time, or not the set, but you know, basically from location, for a long time, up until a few years ago, that was the only reason people knew about this film, was that they had those photographs. But it's a really good question, and in fact, I'll pass on your question to them to encourage them to include that. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Yes, sir.
Well, in relation to that, I noticed they were using hand gestures that were not familiar to me, at least. I assume they were speaking their native language when they were using these. And is that customary? I mean, is that authentic, the hand gestures they were using, the hand language, sign language?
Again, my understanding is that it is, but it's hard to say what's authentic and not. But I'm definitely going to follow up with that question again. With the folks at the Oklahoma Historical Society who would have a better informed understanding of that. I believe so because of the cast and the at least if you believe the account of the production. I would also assume that that is the case, maybe erroneously, because of how silent films how they were normally produced, where a lot of it was ad-libbed, right? Because they knew that the intertitles would be telling the story. So even for those in English, if you actually read, it was kind of what you were saying earlier, if you actually read with lips what they're saying in a silent film, it's not at all in correspondence to anything in particular. Even a film like Singing in the Rain does a great send-up of that. And my feeling is if it's parodied in Singing in the Rain, it's based on some kind of reality, because they were not very kind, right? So, over here, yes, in the back.
In answer to his question, Native Americans did have a sign language that they used to communicate intertribally and so forth. Now, whether that was authentic, historic Native American sign, I don't know, but
Right.
it exists, so it's very plausible.
And that's where it's tricky in terms of this notion of authenticity, because you're right, that did exist, we know it existed. Is this an actual representation of it? Hard to say, and I'm not even sure that they've even had time to dig into this, because part of, I mean, I hate to say it, I'm sort of giving them an out, but it took so long to even get this film back kind of in a place where you could actually watch it. We're kind of early on in the research about the film. So great, thanks, Jen.
You know what the distribution of this film was originally?
I think it's been shown, I think it was shown like 3 times, which is another reason why it's so in such good shape. Because as soon as you put a film through a projector, it starts, to fall apart. So I think that there was maybe 3 showings of it, and then that was the end of it.
Where was it shown?
I think like in Texas and Oklahoma.
And California.
And California.
But again, what I would slightly caution is that the only knowledge that we have of that right now came from Norbert Miles, who was an independent producer. He was hustling Hollywood, so I think he'd tell anything, right? But I just flew back from LA last night, so I'm kind of like, you know what they're like out there. They'll tell you anything. But I think at the most, it played 2-3 times, and I think what's kind of interesting, especially for anybody that's interested in independent film today, it's not that different. You can make a film. The trick is getting it distributed, right? Anybody can make a film in the backyard today, but if you can get it into a place like this, that's important. And I think that's absolutely why we're amazed that this film actually existed. One of the reasons we have so many Hollywood films, right, even after studios themselves trashed the films, is because there were so many copies made. And so a lot of people had copies. We've been able to resurrect it. The original negative of Citizen Kane doesn't fully exist, but we still have lots of prints of Citizen Kane, right? And that wasn't even a popular film. People hated that film. So with something like this, it's even more special. Yeah. Yes, right down here.
Have the Oklahoma Historical Society folks been able to track down any of the family members, of the Parker family members, to see if they had any family recollections of their folks being in the film?
Well, interestingly enough, we got an email a few days ago that came from the Parker genealogical group. It is so big. Of course, Quanah had, I don't know, I've read at least 10 different accounts of how many children that he had, in at least 25, something like this. He had several wives. So there is an entire genealogical group devoted to the Parker family. They got in touch with us and are so excited. They haven't been able to see the film yet, but they've asked us to come to their annual meeting and actually screen the film. So I almost passed out because I got so excited about it, because the idea that we could actually reconnect with some people and actually say, okay, who do you recognize here? Do you, for example, could you tell us a little bit about the sign language? Do you have a little sense of this? Again, we're many generations removed now, but I do know that in some of the interviews that have been given by Quanah's children, they do talk about the film with their father, the bank robbery, but never have I seen a reference to this particular film, which intrigues me even more. So I'm hoping that we could perhaps get in touch with the grandchildren of, certainly of White and Winata, and ask them if they ever heard of this. But that's hopefully going to happen. It has been shown in Oklahoma, but as we know, Parkers are here. We have a lot of Parkers here. I'd of course like to show it in Quanah, Texas, but that's a dream that may not be realized. We'll see. Yes?
I noticed at the end that several of the actors have been identified already. Do you know how that process is going, and how y'all went about identifying the people who were in the film?
would just say how remarkable it is in the intertitles that they say at the beginning of the film who the people are. Well, no, I think that it's a good point to notice this, and that this would have been very unusual. You know, I mean, actors didn't start being being named probably not until 1910 or 1912. So, and certainly not Native American actors, would have just been like, you know, the Native Americans in the film. So that was one of the first things. I mean, how fortunate it is that we have those intertitles and are able to name the lead people. And in terms of the other part, I don't know.
No, it's an interesting point because it actually has a lot to do, what your question in some ways has kind of a really pragmatic aspect to it, and there's another kind of larger question to it, or issue associated with it, which is kind of the evolution of the star system. Because as Janna points out, for a long time with films, after, you know, certainly in the early days, nobody was named. This was not about, there was no star system. This was no Angelina Jolie in, right? This was very unusual for any of the actors to have been named, and particularly Native actors. In terms of the identification, the scant information that does exist does include some information about it, but obviously the Parkers were cast in this as stars. It was their way, obviously, the director and the producer, they knew, their idea anyway, was that people would come and see it because they were in it. Those were those kind of reality stars of the era. And what's happening now is they're going from the scant information that came from the film itself. Usually that's where you start, is the film itself. And then any kind of production notes and then any kind of newspaper articles, that will continue to evolve in addition to work done by the Oklahoma Historical Society. But as I mentioned earlier, what's so exciting about doing this kind of research right now, not to be a complete nerd about it, but it is so exciting that local newspapers are coming online every day. You could not do this kind of research you really couldn't have done this research 50 years ago. So we're in a unique time and place to be able to start digging around to figure out, was Daughter of the Dawn in a number of different films? Let's try to figure that out. We just don't know. And actually, if anybody's interested in helping with this project, come let us know.
Well,
we could use a number of volunteers on this. So.
And I think even a scholar could actually contribute somehow too. I mean, it's clearly a thing where it's just opening a ton of doors for both historical society, but also film scholars and Native American scholars. And I mean, it's just, you can spend the next 50 years trying to figure all this out.
Great, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Sure.
Not just the participants. Did any of those people?
I would say probably not, and that's what I'm so excited when Caroline's saying, "Oh, we'll take it to the family." I mean, there's nothing more satisfying, and I've gotten to have this beautiful opportunity plenty of times to take Native American films, more like documentary sided, and show it to the family members. It's amazing. I mean, that is why we do this stuff, is to reconnect it with the people that it deserves for them to have been able to see. So it's really good stuff.
Yeah, I would wager, I would say no. I would almost definitively say no. And there are a number of reasons as to why that would be the case, and part of it would have been the difficulties of, cost, and the difficulties of doing the kind of projection at that point in time. Just in terms of the area. I would say, however, though, that the only way you might think not is that in the early days of filmmaking, and indeed in Texas throughout the 20th century, there were people that capitalized on this see yourself on the screen phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So particularly with, not necessarily with narratives as much, but with non-narrative films, that was very much a way of getting people into movie houses to begin with, right? So if you think about this issue of films being seen as quite dangerous, because they were, and a lot of people knew about these big fires in Chicago and New York that killed a lot of people by going into the movie theater. If you were an exhibitionist, didn't mean that, okay, it just came out of my mouth. If you were working in film exhibition, you, at the very beginning of the era, 20th century, you had to convince people it was safe, and you had to convince people that there was a reason to come in. So the see yourself on the screen
was absolutely a huge part of the experience, and often those particular kinds of films were shown outdoors. They were shown in circuses, they were shown in fields, particularly in Texas, which was, you know, the last state to have gone from primarily rural to primarily urban. So it wouldn't have been uncommon. I think in this particular case, though, it would have cost these independent producers a lot to come back. And knowing what we do of kind of independent Texas filmmaking particularly out of the Dallas area, I doubt it would have happened. So we're really, really hopeful. I feel like this is the first step in what my colleagues are going to roll their eyes, but I like to call Texpatriation. We are bringing Texans back home, people. So we're like very excited. This is like the first time we've gotten to bring an incredible lost Texas film back home. So we're really, really glad that you came out with us this evening and are glad to chat with people in the lobby if you have any further questions, but really appreciate it. Thanks.